Safraptuno zone West African.
We know what the problem is when we say jihadism. It affects all of our West African areas, and that is of great concern to our organization, ECOWAS. And even today, after our exchange, I understood a lot of things that are happening in Burkina. We will see how to support Burkina in the immediate things that Burkina needs.
The ECOWAS chairman has just acknowledged something few expected, that Burkina Faso is making undeniable progress. Yes, Burkina Faso, the country that withdrew from ECOWAS, the country hit with sanctions, the one many predicted would spiral into instability. And yet, here was the bloc's top figure, publicly recognizing improvements with no buildup, no press release, no prepared remarks. The statement was made during an unremarkable diplomatic briefing, the kind that typically comes and goes without much notice. But this time, something landed. In the middle of a routine report, the chairman said plainly, "There is undeniable progress in Burkina Faso."
The words weren't dramatic, but their impact was immediate, subtle, yet seismic. There was no applause, no follow-up explanation, not even a change in tone. But that's what made it so striking. In diplomacy, it's often the quiet comments that say the most. This wasn't part of a policy shift. It wasn't an attempt to reset relations or soften ECOWAS's position. It was something rarer, an honest observation. Sources close to the chairman say the turning point came after a recent trip to Burkina Faso, officially described as a technical mission. But what he saw on the ground didn't fit into any technical report. He visited local engineers developing energy solutions from scratch. He walked through markets buzzing with local produce in areas once deemed too dangerous to function. There were no international consultants leading the effort, no foreign aid banners, no UN logos, just local people rebuilding, retooling, and moving forward. What he witnessed wasn't just progress, it was autonomy. And that, more than anything, challenged the prevailing narrative. In regions ECOWAS had all but written off, he saw paved roads, functioning schools, and electrified towns. None of it was built through foreign-led initiatives. None of it depended on ECOWAS frameworks or donor approval. That's why the word progress carried so much weight. It didn't just reflect changing conditions, it quietly undermined the story that ECOWAS had been telling for over a year. A story built on the idea that walking away from the bloc would lead to collapse. But that collapse hasn't come. In fact, something else is emerging, a working, independent system. And now the bloc faces a different kind of challenge. Not rebellion, but results. Not defiance, but evidence. The reality is, ECOWAS didn't lose control when Burkina Faso exited. It began losing control the moment its penalties stopped working. Why weren't these military governments collapsing? Why were blacklisted officials, once condemned by the international community, now enjoying surging popularity? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, why were other ECOWAS member states beginning to question whether the bloc itself had become too rigid, too slow, too out of touch with African realities? Then came the contradictions in enforcement. Goods that were supposed to be blocked at the borders kept moving, through informal trade routes, local cooperation, and alternative systems. Regional airlines resumed flights, sometimes under different names or with new paperwork, bypassing restrictions in plain sight. Trade corridors realigned not by negotiation, but by necessity, and they adjusted far faster than ECOWAS's paperwork ever could. The traditional tools of pressure, sanctions, suspensions, embargoes had lost their bite. And everyone inside the bloc knew it, but no one wanted to say it aloud. The silence wasn't just hesitation, it was fear. Because Burkina Faso, along with Mali and Niger, wasn't negotiating to return. They weren't lobbying for forgiveness. They had moved on, and that was more unsettling to ECOWAS than any hostile rhetoric. These weren't rogue states waiting to be pulled back into line. They were creating something new. Military pacts, coordinated positions on currency reform, joint development projects. And the more ECOWAS tried to minimize their efforts, the more visible those efforts became. Not through statements or press conferences, but through action. By the time the Alliance of Sahel States formally announced its own confederation, ECOWAS was no longer dealing with protest. It was facing a political structure, What had once seemed like a reactionary front had evolved into a functioning bloc. ECOWAS continued to speak as though it still held authority, but in reality, it wasn't even part of the conversation anymore. In the streets of Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, the symbols had changed. The flags no longer bore ECOWAS stars. The slogans had shifted, so had the loyalties. To some within ECOWAS, the chairman's recent statement wasn't surprising. Whispers had circulated for months, but protocol and pride kept the truth quiet. Until that single phrase slipped out. Undeniable progress. It confirmed what many inside the system had already begun to realize. ECOWAS no longer controlled the story. And for a bloc built more on influence than force, that's the most dangerous loss of all. Because once people stop believing your rules matter, those rules have no power at all. Now comes the bigger question. Did Burkina Faso actually deserve the praise? By the time the chairman arrived in Ouagadougou, officially for a routine regional inspection, the posture had already shifted. There were no ceremonial greetings, no long speeches, no diplomatic performances. He wasn't treated like a guest of honor. He was treated like a man who had come to see something he couldn't understand from behind a desk. And that's exactly what happened. The streets of the capital weren't silent, but they weren't in disarray. There was order. Buses were running, street vendors were busy, stalls were stocked with local produce. Formerly volatile neighborhoods had been repaired. But what struck him most wasn't what he saw. It was what was missing. There were no foreign aid vehicles, no international NGO tents, no UN insignias on buildings. The development taking place was being carried out not with foreign branding, but with one name stamped everywhere: Burkina Faso. Everywhere he looked, self-reliance had replaced dependency. Local women led agricultural cooperatives, producing enough food to feed entire provinces. Soldiers were instructing young people, some barely out of their teens, not in combat, but in how to install electrical lines in their own villages. In the northern region, once under the control of armed groups, he watched a group of trainees operating bulldozers, laying the groundwork for what would soon become a regional medical center. There was no media coverage, no international donors, just people, quietly doing the work they had once been told was impossible without outside help. Outside Gawa, at a newly constructed refinery, the chairman was shown a process that had once cost the country billions in lost value. Raw gold, previously smuggled or exported unprocessed, was now being refined, sealed, and certified on site by local engineers. One of them, without ceremony, explained the logic. We stopped letting it leave the ground without value. She didn't know it, but she had just summarized a total shift in the country's economic thinking. And it didn't stop there. In the wider Sahel zone, what used to be known as refugee camps had turned into micro-communities. Shared solar panels powered homes. Water tanks were set up using military logistics systems. The zones once called ungovernable were now testing grounds for local security models. No mercenaries, no foreign trainers. The manuals were written in local languages, and the uniforms were sewn by tailors in Bobo Dioulasso. Even the rifles came not from Western allies, but from newer suppliers who asked only for payment, not allegiance. But the most striking moment didn't happen at a refinery or a military post. It happened in a school. In Djibo, the chairman entered a modest classroom, concrete floors, wooden benches, a single teacher, and 28 students crowded around a chalkboard. But what caught his eye wasn't the lesson. It was a banner hanging on the wall, written in bold, clear letters. We don't wait to be saved. We learn to save ourselves. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a philosophy. Not rebellion, but rejection. A full rejection of the idea that progress must be imported, outsourced, or donated. And everywhere he went that day, the same message echoed. Burkina Faso wasn't making progress because it had been welcomed back. It was moving forward because it stopped waiting. For a man who had spent his entire career inside a system that rewarded submission and punished disobedience, that realization was deeply unsettling. Because what he saw wasn't chaos. It wasn't improvisation. It was structure. Indigenous, military-backed, unapologetically local structure. The kind that didn't wait for validation. the chairman left without delivering a formal speech. There was no need. The numbers would never capture what he had witnessed. But his silence and his face said enough. Burkina Faso wasn't challenging ECOWAS with statements. It was challenging it with systems, with classrooms, roads, local industries, and functioning governance, built entirely outside the bloc's orbit. And that raises a far more dangerous question. If this is what rebellion looks like, then what does success even mean anymore? When the ECOWAS chairman uttered the phrase undeniable progress, the world largely heard a compliment. But for those paying attention, it was something else. It wasn't praise, it was a signal. That kind of shift doesn't happen by accident. Not in a bloc where every word is measured, every message agreed upon. The chairman's remark wasn't a gesture of admiration toward Ibrahim Traoré. It was a calibrated move, because something had shifted, not only inside Burkina Faso, but within ECOWAS itself. And it wasn't about values, it was about strategy. The mere fact that he had to speak at all, that silence was no longer sustainable, signaled a deeper calculation in motion. One that had less to do with Burkina Faso's performance and more to do with ECOWAS's growing fear of irrelevance. Until now, the bloc had operated with a core assumption that time would bring the breakaway states back into line, that sanctions, political isolation, and lack of formal recognition would wear them down, that Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso would eventually either stumble or return. But Traoré changed that equation. He didn't isolate, he built. He didn't seek legitimacy, he created facts on the ground. He didn't wait for an invitation, he delivered results. And for ECOWAS, the worst part was that his model wasn't being ignored. It was starting to inspire quiet conversations in other capitals. Some civilian governments, especially in coastal West Africa, had begun asking questions behind closed doors. What if this military-backed governance model is more agile than the bloated civilian structures we've been defending? What if cutting ties with outside donors creates real sovereignty? What if we stopped waiting for IMF instructions and started building with what we already have? For ECOWAS, these aren't just difficult questions, they're destabilizing. The chairman knows it. That's why his remark, delivered as if offhand, wasn't a peace offering. It was a flare. A warning to other member states that the center was wobbling, that the status quo was no longer guaranteed. It was also a test, because by publicly recognizing progress in Burkina Faso, he forced other ECOWAS leaders into a choice: continue pretending the Sahel had collapsed, or acknowledge the shift in risk contradicting the bloc's official line. His words didn't just adjust perception, they demanded alignment. Leaders now had to respond. Either echo the recognition and open the door to dialogue, or stay silent and risk appearing detached from the realities on the ground. At the same time, the chairman's statement created diplomatic flexibility. ECOWAS needs a path to re-engage with the Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, without appearing to backpedal. A formal reintegration would compromise the authority the bloc has worked to maintain. But a few scattered words of praise? That's a low-risk opening. A quiet bridge back into relevance. Not necessarily for reconciliation, but for strategic positioning. Because if the Sahel alliance continues to consolidate through Russian security agreements, Chinese-funded infrastructure, and growing Pan-African political solidarity, then ECOWAS risks becoming a bloc that only speaks to itself. And in regional politics, once you lose leverage, you stop being a player. You become a spectator, or worse, a relic. So no, the chairman didn't speak out of admiration. He spoke out of necessity. He saw what Burkina Faso had built. He saw what ECOWAS had failed to prevent. And he understood, too late, that staying silent had become more dangerous than saying something. But despite the calm delivery, the real message wasn't aimed at Traoré. It was aimed at the rest of West Africa. They're not collapsing, they're rising. And if ECOWAS doesn't adjust, it may be the one left behind. There was a time when Burkina Faso's military government was treated as an interruption, a temporary detour on the road back to civilian rule, a phase that, like others before it, would eventually be corrected, rebranded, and reabsorbed into the framework of Western-backed governance. But that time has passed, and the ECOWAS chairman's reluctant acknowledgement is just the latest indicator of that shift. Because Traoré isn't simply managing Burkina Faso, he's modeling something far more disruptive to the old order, a functioning alternative. That's what makes him different from the many strongmen who came before. They ruled with spectacle and fell under the weight of ego. Traoré, in contrast, has chosen the far more radical path, making things work. Schools are opening, markets are stabilizing, foreign currency reserves are rising. National production is slowly replacing dependence on imports. This isn't theoretical, it isn't symbolic or broadcast for donor optics. It's physical, local, and measurable. In an era where many African governments have mastered the art of performing for foreign partners, Traoré has bypassed the script. He doesn't attend summits, he doesn't wear a tie, he doesn't speak in development jargon. He governs like a man with no interest in convincing outsiders and every incentive to deliver for those within. That alone would be enough to rattle ECOWAS. But what's happening beyond Burkina Faso's borders is what truly signals a turning point. The countries once ridiculed for breaking away are no longer isolated. They're coordinating defense strategies, co-developing infrastructure, pursuing a shared currency free of CFA-era remnants. The AES alliance isn't just a defection. It's becoming the nucleus of a new regional model. And its ideological anchor? It's not Goïta. It's not Tiani. It's Traoré. He's younger, less entrenched, and more attuned to a generation that no longer equates dependency with identity. He speaks simply, acts directly, and delivers outcomes that resonate far beyond his own borders. When West African youth carry his face on protest signs in Senegal or painted on alley walls in Ghana, they're not pledging allegiance to a government. They're identifying with an idea. He's become a symbol of possibility. That's what ECOWAS didn't predict. That leadership in the region wouldn't come from legacy or alliance, but from results. In a landscape where many leaders still govern like colonial proxies, Traoré has altered the blueprint. He's made dignity functional, not just aspirational. And the longer that model holds, the harder it becomes to reverse. Burkina Faso may not have skyscrapers or massive state budgets, but it has what no resolution can manufacture: momentum. Every restored village, every operating refinery, every soldier retrained as an engineer. None of these are symbolic. They are precedents, and precedents spread. That's why, despite the chairman's measured praise, no formal reconciliation is on the table. Because Traoré doesn't need to rejoin the old system, he's building a new one where Africa defines its path and where progress isn't measured by international applause, but by how many children eat, learn, and live without fear. Burkina Faso isn't asking to lead, it's simply moving forward. And the rest of the region is watching, not out of loyalty, but because they want to know what's coming next. Why did ECOWAS suddenly break its silence on Burkina Faso? What exactly did the chairman see that changed everything? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Was it just a diplomatic gesture or a political earthquake? And if you'd like to see more content like this on Black culture, civilization, history, and the legacy of African strength, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.